Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live stream of the Midwestern Marxists, brought to you by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Real quick before we get started, I want to mention that everybody knows we get throttled and shadow banned and all that. So for real, please click like, subscribe, the little bell thing, whatever. I know I hate asking to do it, but it does help us. Give the link to your buddies, all that kind of stuff. Maybe we can shoot up and try to overcome that algorithmic suppression we suffer from. Today, I'm here with my brothers and comrades, Eddie Liger and Carlos Garrido, and we are going to discuss Lyin James Lindsay, and we're going to sort of dissect a video of his where he's explaining how actually modern bourgeois ideology is really Marxism. So that should be fun. And along with that, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. Before we get started, though, I do want to mention thank you, Ross, for the super sticker right off the bat. You do not know how much that stuff helps. We have no funding, so everything we get to build this institute up and become the People's Institute comes from all of y'all. And with that, let's get started right after this.
All right. Cobra Commander, thank you for saying I look like a superhero in disguise with the glasses. When I take them off, I become communist man. Now I'm just Eddie for today, though.
You're my hero anyway, brother. So, how is everybody doing? How is your weekend going?
Good. I've just been hanging out with my roommates. Watched Harry Potter yesterday, the first one. They're in the basement watching the second one right now. I know that makes you a liberal, to read Harry Potter rather than read theory, but it's good to relax sometimes. That was good. I'm excited to break down this James Lindsay guy. I'd never heard of him, but it seems like the perfect video for the three of us to break down, so I'm pumped.
One of the arguments that they used to have around the time the Third International, the Comintern was getting started, was how they went about sort of explaining the falsity, lies, etc., of bourgeois ideologies. And Bukharin was often criticized for going after the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones, right? Ben Shapiro's easy. Bosch is easy, right? But from what I'm given to understand, this guy, Lyin James Lindsay, is whom they consider the top, the cream of the crop, the intellectual anti-communist, right? So let's go for the best. Let's, sort of a give us what you got kind of deal,
Yeah, I've seen some of his clips going around online. It's very similar. It seems to be a more coherent form of the extremely incoherent arguments we debunked when we were covering, I think, Tick History's video on the religion or the cult of dialectics. So I haven't seen the one that we're going to watch today, but I wonder if it's in the same vein. And if so, it's not new. It's just the same old bullcrap sort of repackaged as a hot new intellectual anti-communist commodity. But we must do our task and debunk it either way.
Yeah, I don't expect we'll have much trouble with this. Every single criticism of Marxism I've ever come across kind of goes like this. Step one, make up a bunch of crazy stuff about Marxism. And this begins even with Eugen Doring, right? But anyway, you start with making up a bunch of stuff. And then as you continue to elaborate, you maybe cherry pick a few quotes, throw them out of context, and you start criticizing all these things you made up, right? And then you say, oh, those things are Marxism. Marxism defeated. What can we do about it? And each time, it's a bunch of bullcrap, as Carlos just said.
And this is what's so frustrating about the state of the left, and the CIA infiltrated left or synthetic left, whatever you want to call it, is it also allows the right to say this is Marxism and attack it. I've been saying, like, if working class people in this country all knew what communism and Marxism were, I was saying this on a TikTok live yesterday, they'd be, the majority of them would want revolution tomorrow, or they'd be Marxists in a minute. It's that they're constantly bombarded with propaganda to just confuse them about what Marxism actually is, and tell them that Marxism is wokeism or whatever. And I think I haven't seen the video yet, but I assume that's what we're going to get here from this fella.
And there's a relationship between these two things, right? The leftists believe it when they're told this, and then the rightists believe the leftists who are telling them, yes, that's correct. But if you actually go to the Marx, it has nothing whatsoever in the world to do with actual Marxism. And I'm sorry I stepped on you there, Carlos. It won't happen again.
Apology not accepted. Joking.
Damn.
But yeah, I forgot where I was going with that. So.
All right, are we ready to jump into the video then?
Let's do it, brother.
Here we go. The best 30-minute explanation of Marxism I have ever heard. More like the worst explanation.
Boo, boo, boo. Ooh, we got no sound.
Oops, I muted myself for the intro.
Hello, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I want to address something Tom just said, which is, in fact, that woke is supposed to advance equity in Europe. So here's the definition of equity, and see if it sounds like a definition of anything else you've ever heard of. The definition of equity comes from the public administration literature. It was written by a man named George Frederickson. And the definition is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. Does that sound like anything you've heard of before?
Keep on it. Already. First lie, right? Where do you get the idea that socialism is simply redistributing everything so that everyone is made equal? Which socialist country has done this? Which Marxist thinker has written this? I'd like a little substantiation, but of course that substantiation does not exist because he's making this up.
Don't you know that in Capital Volume 1, Marx says socialism is when you take the stock market and divide it by the number of people in the country and then just give shares equally to everyone in the country. And then socialism is achieved. That's actually what China's like. Just kidding, of course.
They're going to administer an economy to make shares equal. The only difference between equity and socialism is the type of property that they redistribute, the type of shares. They're going to redistribute social and cultural capital in addition to economic and material capital. And so this is my thesis. When we say, what is woke? Woke is Maoism with American characteristics, if I might borrow from Mao himself, who said that his philosophy was Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics.
All right, stop again, stop again. Here's another clue that he's either lying by presenting himself as an expert or lying directly. When did Mao say his thought or policies were Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics? When? Never happened, right? Mao Zedong thought develops after Mao is dead, right? And they start trying to do it as he's living. He says, please don't call anything Maoism. But then socialism with Chinese characteristics develops as a description of the society they have post hoc, right? So as things develop, they're describing what is, rather than this is our plan and what we seek to do and implement in the real world. And I also like Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics, which is a phrase that comes out of nowhere that he just made up.
Right. You can make the argument for socialism with Chinese characteristics being in Mao, especially in the epoch of the debates with how it was that the Chinese struggle was sometimes in contradictions with the geopolitical interests of the Soviet Union, and there was these clashes. And it's really there where the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics sort of emerges from, and you kind of see parts of that implied in the New Culture movement, which was before the founding of the Communist Party itself. Like they're thinking explicitly, well, what is the science that we can use to help China? Which one is best capable of understanding our specific conditions and our specific characteristics? But just to equate this with wokeism is completely deranged, because the sort of the way that the particular is treated in wokeism is completely different from Marxism-Leninism. In Marxism-Leninism, the particular is still a universal particular. There's still an understanding of, let's say, common humanity or the common characteristic of socialism, or Marxism-Leninism as a sort of universally valid philosophy that then has to be applied to specific, particular, concrete circumstances in order for the method itself, the universal, to even make sense. With wokeism, what you have is a complete divorce of the particular from the universal, such that the idea of universality itself is completely destroyed in favor of, just sheer tribalism. And we've talked about this a few times, but that woke, those philosophical assumptions, which are rooted in Foucault and Heidegger and in other bourgeois and even Nazi thinkers called Schmidt, it goes back to the reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a movement that ends up believing in human capabilities, in the capacity of human reason to understand the world, in the ideas of progress and understanding that humanity is progressing forward. And there was a very reactionary turn against this that usually took the form of an irrationalist romanticism and a turn away from reason and a turn towards the romanticization and fetishization of pre-Enlightenment societies and an era where reason wasn't, so universally accepted, and where the ideas of a universal common humanity that we all share it wasn't coming to the fore as like the dominant form of thinking about what we are and what connection do we have with everyone else. And what was prioritized was like difference separated from the notion of like the dialectic of identity and difference. And again, it was just a different form of tribalism. So when you look at the philosophical foundations, you have in wokeism a deep form of tribalism, which is rooted not just in postmodernism and that itself rooted in these Nazi philosophers and they themselves being based on anti-Enlightenment thinkers. And Marxism, you have the complete opposite of that. It's the completion of Enlightenment, taking it to its rational conclusion and realizing that, well, if we really want an emancipatory movement, if we really want to consider common humanity and universal reason, and if we really want progress, we have to understand that we have to look at these concretely. And there's a specific class that can emancipate humanity. You can't have this utopian socialist dream of sort of harmonizing class antagonisms, you have to look at what specific class in our era can emancipate humanity, and that was the proletariat. And in some instances, in Russia and in China and Cuba, you realize that, well, along with the proletariat as a producing class, you have the peasantry and farmers. And so, philosophically, it couldn't be more contrary to wokeism, but because what passes as Marxism in the West is this distorted image, which they have to do, because if not, people will accept Marxism and realize that it's not the same philosophy as the liberal part of the bourgeoisie. And that's why he's able to make that connection, because the Marxism itself of the West has accepted and internalized an outlook that is fundamentally antagonistic to what it claims to be.
Yeah, I had something similar to say to Carlos, because a friend of mine actually said this the other day. Like, the wokeism stuff that's going on is the same as the Cultural Revolution in China, right? And he said, right, Eddie? And I was like, actually, they're pretty much opposites. The Cultural Revolution, it made mistakes, and today they say that they regret it in China, but it was to change the culture to fit the new mode of production, right? It was to adjust society to this new socialist mode of production that was coming about and overthrowing the backwards, as Carlos said, semi-feudal landlord oligarch run mode of production that existed before. Wokeism is enforced from the top down in order to maintain the capitalist mode of production. It's to say, real liberation is just diversifying the 1% rather than actually engaging in class struggle against the 1%. And I mean, if you look at who's like pushing wokeism, you see it from, the CIA, or at least woke imperialism, various NGOs, the institutions in power that represent the bourgeoisie. If you look at the Cultural Revolution, in some ways you could say it was enforced top down, but it was enforced by the newly ruling working class who had just overthrown the landlord class, the murderous, torturing, exploitative landlord class. It wasn't the landlord class enforcing a cultural revolution on the people below. It was the working class rising up and saying, we want to move our culture forward. So really nothing to even compare there between wokeism and the Cultural Revolution in China.
And even from the beginning, what like the sort of germs of what becomes wokeism, which is the Frankfurt School and the cultural Marxists, right? From the beginning was a bourgeois project. And if this guy were honest, he would look into the history of that. Well, who was spreading the work of Horkheimer and Adorno? Guess what? It was the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, right? All of these giant capitalist class entities that were interested in combating Marxism with this fake Marxism. So taking the word Marxism, getting rid of the substance that was there, and putting what they want in its place and selling that to the public, right? And in the modern iteration, and we can go over all the empirical grounds for this, but wokeism begins, and there's work done on this, begins in corporate boardrooms, right? The First Privilege Walk, a fantastic essay by Christian Parenti, Michael Parenti, famous Marxist intellectual's son, wrote this, and he talks about how it was actually Herbert Marcuse's wife designing this privilege theory program in order to promote this ideology from the corporate masters down. And that's how it goes, from their institutions downward into the public, whereas the Cultural Revolution, flawed and horrific as it sometimes got, child soldiers is not a good thing, but was the bottom up, right? It was an anarchistic tendency, an ultra-left tendency, rather than this sort of bourgeois, rootless cosmopolitan notion of being a universal entity unto yourself that no one can tell you what your lived experience was, etc. And not to get into a whole thing, but yeah, it's ridiculous. There's no empirical ground for what he's saying.
And what we've done here is provide, just real quick, both material objective and then subjective and ideological ways in which not only is what's called wokeism or cultural Marxism or Western Marxism fundamentally antagonistic to the traditions of Marxism that have constructed socialism, primarily Marxism-Leninism. They're not only like different, they're antagonistic. As you mentioned, while Horkheimer, Adorno, French theory, certain French Marxists are being propped up by the Ford Foundation, by the Rockefeller Foundation, by the State Department. They're an integral part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other anti-communist programs that aimed at creating a compatible left. While those people are getting propped up, who's getting suppressed? What form of Marxism is getting suppressed? It's Marxism-Leninism, right? You have to hide your Marxist-Leninist texts, and you couldn't read or often find stuff from the Soviet Union or from revolutionary China. And, you would get in trouble if you would assign these sorts of readings in the university. And while it was perfectly fine to have like some of these key Frankfurt School people teaching, right? And there were some cases where like they'd get harassed by like far-right conservative people, but that was in contradiction to like what the leading forms of bourgeois ideology was taking. So you have that fake Marxism being propped up, Marxism-Leninism being suppressed and repressed and prohibited. And so it's, when you look at both ideologically, how its philosophical assumptions are completely opposite, and then materially, how the political economy of knowledge that props one up completely represses the other, to say that they're the same is to be as wrong as you could possibly be about anything.
Real quick, we are only a minute into this, as Eddie just told us in the private chat we have. But I just want to say before we continue, he looked right here. He looks like he's about to order the gabagool. Sorry.
He does. Bring me the gabagool.
Woke is Marxism. That's a very provocative statement. It's something you will certainly hear it is not, that it is different. And the professors and the philosophers will spend a large amount of time explaining to you why. No, it's about economics when it's Marxism. This is social, this is cultural.
Again.
It's not different.
Another lie. Marxism is not just about economics. It's both. It is the social and the economic. It is the way that we go about producing all the things that make us society, informing how that society looks. Sorry.
I need you to think biologically for one moment, and I don't mean about your bodies. We could do that. That's a different topic. I want you to think how we organize plants and animals when we study them. They're species, but above species, there are the genus of the animals. So you think like the cats, all the cats, but you have tigers, you have lions, you have house cats, you have whatever, leopards, many different kinds of cats. If we think of Marxism as a genus of ideological thought, then classical economic Marxism is a species. Radical feminism is a species in this same genus. Critical race theory is a species in this genus. Queer theory is a species in this genus. Post-colonial theory.
And this is all the stuff Gabriel Rockhill has criticized and said has grown out of this, anti-Marxist Marxism, this CIA, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation funded Marxism. And then this is the mirror of that. This is the other side of that, right? That distorts Marxism. And then you have these right wingers who say that's what Marxism is. Attack it because Marxism is wokeism and, all these fancy, trendy bourgeois theories.
And you can tell that not only are they not reading Marxism when they talk about it, they're not even reading these other theories that they claim to be Marxism. I've read them. Finishing a PhD in philosophy, I've had to read all of this shit. One of the main targets of all of them is Marxism. They precisely position themselves as like the radical, and always Marxism takes the form of, no, Marxism is actually not radical. Socialism is actually not qualitatively different from what we've seen in capitalism. We need something so radically new, a third way. And usually, the vast majority of the time, the main targets of their critique is the existing forms of anti-capitalist arrangements, socialist countries, and the dominant form of Marxism that has existed in these countries, which is Marxism-Leninism. So it's they not only not read the Marxists, but they also don't read the people who they say the Marxists that are Marxists. Like it's so intellectually ignorant that one would have to be extremely disconnected from any of these conversations to even think about making those connections.
In fact, the way they approach looking at the world in all of these hip bourgeois theories is precisely the opposite of how Marxism views it. How we view how people are made into people and how change happens is the opposite of them. And they criticize us and say that because Marx was from Germany, he couldn't possibly understand the situation arising in Africa. It is so fundamentally different. There is a wall between the two that Marx cannot possibly comprehend the general laws of development for all of society, because all of society is necessarily cut off from each other and distinct. Like Carlos was saying earlier, it's very tribalistic, and this is why it shares the same assumptions as Nazis, right? Why the same premises just lead to different conclusions.
It's absolutized relativism. Whereas our relativism, when we have it, it's always concrete, like and embedded within an understanding of like the necessary relationship of the relative and the universal. But do we want to get to this real quick, Eddie?
Yeah, do it.
So Yellow Like Parenti says, by the way, the Yellow Parenti lectures are the best. I've joked before that in the same way that in bourgeois schools today, they bring out the TV in the middle of class and they put some BS documentary. We'll be doing that in socialism, but with Parenti. Carlos, was Marx discussed in any of your philosophy classes? I was a Phil major, and not one class discussed him, even though he's a giant on par with Hegel, Kant, Aquinas, Plato, etc. I was kind of lucky. I was in a university where the director of or my philosophy counselor when I was in undergrad was the head of the DSA. So Marxism was all over the place. And then the political science professor who I took the most classes with was also a part of DSA, and his partner was another leading member of DSA, and they were all well, the philosophy one had more anarchistic tendencies, but the political science one had studied in China, and he was definitely pro-communist. And even the ones that had different ideological preferences, they were not like deeply anti-communist or anything. So Marx was always there for me, and pretty much every philosophy professor that I had was had sympathies for socialism, if not were explicit Marxists. So, but that's very rare, and in graduate school, it wasn't the same experience, even though people weren't like anti-communist explicitly. There's more of these different ideologies that James Lindsay is here trying to say are all derivatives of Marxism.
And again, if he had actually learned about these theories, he'd see that they have nothing whatsoever in common with Marxism. So again, he's lying about something, either presenting himself as an expert on things he has no idea and knows he hasn't learned about, or directly lying about these things. Either way, Lyin James Lindsay loses again.
You bet. Noah, you want to answer the super chat we got from Lemonheads? What's you mean by cosmopolitan? I live in an urban city, and honestly, this offends me. Lemonheads is triggered. Just kidding. Thank you for the super chat.
We love Lemonheads, by the way. He's great.
Yes.
No, there's a difference between cosmopolitan and urban, first of all. So I live in an urban city. I grew up in the inner city, actually, in Cleveland. What cosmopolitanism is, and its more formal term, rootless cosmopolitanism. It's a sort of ideological view of gentrifiers. Think about it that way, right? The middle classes that, to give you a modern example, when people, middle class people go to the left and say they are an internationalist, what they really mean is that they're a rootless cosmopolitan, right? They don't really view nations as material things having relationships with each other. They'll say, I'm not an American because I don't view myself as an American, rather than recognizing the material world around them that helps create them and shapes how they think, the assumptions they have, the way they answer questions, etc. And so what they get to instead of internationalism, which is the Marxist position, right? That workers all share a common humanity and history, et cetera, they get to a sort of globalism, for lack of a better word, where they believe that, you know, their universal individual experience in the particular is universal. Where, I don't know, do you want to keep going from here, Carlos?
Yes, it's rooted in the forms of, I guess, Enlightenment humanism, which precede Marxism's critique and sublation of Enlightenment humanism, where the individual human and the common humanity is treated in a very abstract way, which ignores the very real class and national determinations and racial determinations in some contexts that shape our experience as human beings. And you know, the Marxists, in part, like Marxism takes up this Enlightenment tradition, but it takes it up through a process of overcoming it. That means that there's a part of it that's critiqued and canceled, and another more rational part that's elevated. And what's done is, the idea is that, yes, we still want to emancipate humanity at large and overcome alienation, and but we are living in societies that are structured through classes, and where there's exploiters, exploited, some classes in the middle that have a little bit of both. And the idea ends up being that really, in order to emancipate all of humanity, you end up having to find what specific class has the capacity to do that. Very early on, Marx said it was the proletariat because it was the class that endured all of the evils of existing society. And so by removing all of those for itself, it removes it for everyone else. So this idea of like cosmopolitanism, I see it as rooted in like a pre-Marxian form of Enlightenment universalism, which is the word that Noah used, rootless. That means it's not rooted, it's not concrete, it's an abstract, almost empty universal.
That's plaguing Europe is a species in this genus, and they have something that binds them together called intersectionality that makes them treated as if they are all one thing.
Come on. Are we ever going to get like 2 minutes into this video?
Probably not. Not if he keeps saying stuff like this.
Right.
I mean, all it is, it's exactly what you said when you sent us this video. He's just taking all the hip liberal bourgeois theories and calling them Marxism.
Right. And intersection, let's go over just real quick why intersectionality is a bourgeois theory and not a Marxist one, right? So remember all the things we were just saying about the tribalism and why it's so similar to Nazi ideology. Intersectionality considers all of these different forms of oppression that are real oppression it's trying to address, don't get me wrong, but it considers them cut off from each other, and they can intersect in certain individuals, right? Whereas Marxism has a deeper material view of why this happens. The struggle against racism is, for example, a concrete form that the class struggle, which is a universal, takes on due to the particular conditions that give rise to it, right? Chattel slavery goes into Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all just forms of class struggle. And to use the genus species, it's more like class struggle is the genus, and Black liberation, for example, is the species. Intersectionality says that these groups are antagonistic until they intersect in certain people.
And just real quick, I pulled up a video where I sort of debunked the idea that Marxism and intersectionality are compatible, and I show why its internal logics are antagonistic. Marxism understands the world as already being an in an interconnected and in a universal interconnectedness to everything else. And intersectionality artificially reifies that in order to then make its project about artificially reconnecting it. And the ways of approaching the question of like the relationships of race to class, it's very bourgeois in the sense that it's embedded in like separating things from each other, reifying things, and treating them as isolated forms that then artificially get brought together through the intersectional method. And that's wrong. It divorces. It fails to see how like the struggle against like racism, the struggle against Jim Crow and lynching, and all those struggles weren't just like anti-racist struggles separated from like the class struggle. There were forms of the class struggle, and the same thing with the women's struggle for the suffrage movement, and all these different struggles. They are forms of class struggle. They are struggles that antagonize a people, a part of the people, with the ruling capitalist elite interest. And that's part of the difference that you have today with some of these bourgeois feminist or bourgeois anti-racist, bourgeois intersectionality struggles, which is that they don't challenge capital in ways in which the old school anti-racist struggle or feminist struggle did. Like they were class struggles because they were rooted in working class movements or parts of working class movements, and they challenged capitalism, they challenged imperialism. Today, that's turned into its opposite in it being absorbed within bourgeois academies and bourgeois NGOs and the media and leading institutions. It turned into its opposite in the sense that today, anti-racism or anti-sexism or all these different pseudo-progressive ideologies are used in order to proliferate the interest of capitalism and imperialism. And the connection of all of these is what we end up calling wokeism. And we consider it to be central to the ideology of the liberal bourgeoisie today. And that's, again, fully antagonistic to the tradition of the people that a lot of these theorists in the academy end up appealing to, people like Du Bois and the old school Angela Davis and Claudia Jones and these other revolutionary communist figures that fought for the emancipation of women, the emancipation of black people and of colonized people as a struggle against capital.
Convince you of that, because Marx had a very simple proposition, but we get lost. We think that Marx was talking about economics because he often talked about economics. He wrote a book called Capital. It's a very famous book. And we think, well, this is about economic theory, but this isn't true. It's only true on the surface. If we go below the surface, what Marx was talking about was something different. We know what Marx's hypothesis was that we must seize the means of production if we're going to bring socialism to the nations, to the world. We have to seize the means of production. So we have to ask, what does he mean? And if we think that it's about capital, then we miss what he means. If you think it's about the means of production in the factory with a hammer and the means of production in the field with a sickle, then you miss what it means. Because Marx explained what makes human beings special in his earlier writings. And what makes human beings special is that man...
I want to stop it there because the means of production is very strictly defined in Marx, right? And I mean, he's right in that it's not just about economics. Capital is an analysis of the capitalist mode of production, and the kind of society that brings about. But, it is focused on production, and every society needs to manage production in some way. And the relationship to the means of production determines a lot about what you do and how you live your life in society and how that society works. But means of production themselves are very strictly defined. He says they're not talking about the hammer, they're not talking about the sickle. Yes, they are. The means of production is the tools, it's the raw materials. I believe land is included in there, buildings, factories, machines. Right, it's the means of production. It's the things that are used in production that, when combined with human labor power, create, under capitalism, commodities or create use values, create the things that we need to survive, create your house, create the food that you eat. So Marx, didn't say much of like exactly what socialism would look like. He didn't describe exactly what it would look like, and he certainly didn't call for like a cultural revolution or anything. He just said seizure of the means of production, meaning right now the capitalists own the means of production. And if you do not own the means of production, that means your only option is to sell your labor in a market in order to survive. That's how our current system works. And Marx said the workers, the people selling their labor, should take hold of the means of production so that they can organize society in a rational way and eventually move to a classless society where everyone's a worker. And everyone has equal ownership, or not, maybe not equal, but everyone has ownership of the means of production, the tools. So when Marx is making these economic analyses, they're material. They have their basis in reality. So when we're talking about means of production, it's not some abstract thing. It's a very concrete thing that has a very concrete meaning that James Lindsay is going to try and obscure here.
And not only did he say the workers should seize the means of production, he says they will, right? But aside from that, what he's going to try to do here is to go over a very basic point of Marxism. Everything else in society gets its character from how production is carried out. And the reason seizing the means of production is important is because it resolves the contradiction between the relations of production, the worker and owner, and the forces of production, right? The fact that there's one owner and we need all these people working at the factory. And this contradiction creates the struggle between the classes and defines how we look at things, right? What he's going to say and try to argue is that all of the deviations, all of the people who abandon Marxism and say, no, the source is in culture, are still Marxists and still following Marxist logic. But this right here is the crux of it and why we know he's lying about understanding Marxism. If he understood even the very, very basics, the first few things you learn, he would know that these, like the Frankfurt School, the culturalists, etc., abandoned Marxism completely and became anti-Marxists. Another
Right.
one.
His whole basis of analysis is the same as the Western Marxists, and that's why he has to say, yeah, we think it's capital and we think it's political economy that he's looking at. But really, if you go to the young Marx, if you go to Marx when he's 26 years old and writing the economic and philosophical manuscripts, it's totally something else. It has nothing to do with just political economy. And that's the same move of the quote-unquote Western Marxists. And it was a move that was grounded in a reaction to Marxism-Leninism. They didn't like Marxism-Leninism. They didn't like the fact that you had a socialist society where the working class was in power. They were developing the forces of production, increasing the living standards of hundreds of millions of people. And because it wasn't abolishing the state, or because it wasn't fully implementing a non-exploitative society or a fully non-alienated society, they were criticizing it because it was imperfect to whatever socialism was in their heads. And the way that they did that while still holding on to Marx was saying, really, the essence of Marxism, it's not these thousands of pages of published work on political economy. It's not the thousands of pages of unpublished and recently published work on political economy and the elaboration of the dialectical materialist worldview. It's actually this short, 200 or so pages that he writes in 1844 that he explicitly decides never to publish. But that's the real Marx. The Marx before he develops Marxism is the real Marx, and it's completely absurd. But by him making that same move, he's functioning within the same logic, within the same philosophical assumptions as these Western Marxists and these people that come from the same milieu that end up then developing ideologically or serving as the ideological grounds for what we call today wokeism. So it's he thinks he's fighting against it, but he's really working with the same assumptions as the people that he's fighting against. And his only move is to say, well, the people who were always the enemies of these people, they're actually the same thing. Insofar as you understand, like Marxists, in the way that the vast majority of people in the American Academy do, as the Frankfurt School, French theory, then he's technically not wrong, but that's why our task is to say that's not Marxism. That's not Marxism. That has nothing to do with the Marxism that has developed around the world. That's a distorted CIA compatible left form of Marxism or critical theory, whatever you want to call it.
And that just reminds me real quick before we move on. I really think you're too nice in letting them call themselves Western Marxists, brother. Like you were just saying, it's not Marxism. And that sort of trick of language that they both do has a relationship and reinforces itself. So between Lindsay and them, they sort of play off each other, rationalizing and justifying their use of Marxism off of that. But we, as Marx himself says, we do not judge a man by his opinion of himself, right? We judge it against whether it adds up to what the real world says of it, right? So in this, the substance isn't Marxism. So let's just call it, bourgeois culturalism or whatever. It doesn't matter. Nazi tribalism, maybe, because that was its most developed form in Heidegger,
is a being that is incomplete and knows that he is incomplete. He is a man whose true nature has been forgotten to him, which is social being. He is a socialist at heart who doesn't realize it. And the reason he doesn't realize it is because of the economic conditions operating as the means of construction or production, not just of the economy, but of him, but of man, of society, and particularly of history. Marx said that he had the first scientific study of history. How was history produced? By man, doing man's activity, and man's key activity was economic activity, as he saw it. And so economic production doesn't just produce the goods and services of the economy, it produces society itself. And society in turn produces man. He called this the inversion of praxis. And so
stop real quick. Okay, so while what he said was actually mostly correct, that's not what he called the inversion of praxis.
I was gonna say I don't know if I even know what that means or if I've ever heard that.
It's oldie time. Go ahead, Carlos.
It has nothing to do. I mean, it's the inversion of praxis. What the fuck with the inversion of praxis is just like going back to forms of bourgeois idealism that bifurcate subject and object, and thought and activity. Praxis is just the notion that at every instance there's not this thing on one end that's subject and on the other end object, or this thing that we have as activity or practice and on the other hand thought or ideas. We're always with both conjoined. Every time we're acting, we're simultaneously thinking, and every time we're thinking, we're simultaneously acting, right? It's a unity of subject and object, a unity of action and thought, and that's a revolutionary step forward from the history of philosophy that has had to tackle 1,000,001 problems because it starts from these assumptions that divide subject and object, the res cogitans from the res extensa, the thinking substance from the extended substance. And, this is overcome first in Hegel, and then it's developed by Marx. That's why Lenin says in his philosophical notebooks that the critique that Marx makes of the young Hegelians is a Hegelian critique. And that's what you see in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. And I have a whole chapter on that in my upcoming book on Hegel, Marxism, and dialectics. But the inversion of praxis, what the fuck? I have never heard of that. And I've read not just like all the classics, but also all the stuff that the Western Academy tells you is Marxism. I've never heard of the phrase the inversion of praxis. It's just completely ridiculous, made up nonsense. And the fact that someone can get up, wear a suit and a tie. If you wear, like from now on, if you wear a suit and a tie, you better know your shit. If you're going to give a speech in a suit and a tie, know your shit. And if it looks like when I first saw a clip of this, it looked like he was in the UN, and I was like, who let, a sophomore libertarian in the UN to give a speech on Marxism? Are these people not embarrassed? Like, this is embarrassing. It's hard to watch this, because
they have no shame. There's no shame there. It's all like I'm getting paid money to do this. I'm being successful right now, even though it's just a complete lack of intellectual rigor to the point of, any of us would be deeply embarrassed to put something out there that was this wrong.
Thank you,
Inversion
Rob.
of Praxis was an episode of Star Trek. That's freaking hilarious.
Look, we're gonna get through this, I promise, and we'll sort of let him go a little bit. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that we've been going almost an hour now, and we've only been able to make it through not even 5 minutes of this. Have you guys lost count of the amount of lies? I have too. And if this clown is their top thinker, it's no wonder he can't actually answer the Marxists criticizing him, because he's just a con man.
Yeah, what we should have done is just like, you guys ever watch Cinema Sins, where they just like tally up the number of errors in every movie? Should have just done that, counted up this guy's lies. We'd be at 100 by now.
We should do that. Just get a counter and do that for this kind of stuff in the future.
I like it. That's a good idea, honestly.
Sees the means of production, and he's talking about factories and fields. He's actually talking about how we construct who we are as human beings so that we might complete ourselves, so that we might complete history. And at the end of history, mankind will remember that he is a social being.
He is talking about, I'm sorry to stop it again, but he is talking about the factories and fields, but that affects who we are. That affects how we think. That affects the goods that we have available to distribute and consume. It affects what our life activity is. You spend most of your time at work. So then that in turn affects the culture and affects the society. So the society is based upon and largely stems from production. Also, it's not just the production of, agricultural goods or industrial goods, like he's saying. The bourgeoisie also controls the production of information. They control the media, the education system. So, this control over the means of production, which gives you control over production itself, turns into or gives you great control in society and conditions the way that society runs on a daily basis. So it's not that Marx, was talking about one or the other, either culture or economic production. He was talking about the both and the unity between them.
Right. And that's not to say, like, I made a critique earlier of like him making the statement that we have to go back to the early Marx and how the Western Marxists did. That's not to say that we should cancel out the early Marx. I think there's a rational kernel there that ends up getting developed and refined and becomes more rigorous as he studies political economy and develops and matures as a thinker and develops along with Engels the dialectical materialist worldview, not just view of society, but worldview, view of nature, thinking, and society. But it's still a deeply humanistic worldview. And again, you could argue that it's partly grounded in his ideological influences stemming from the Enlightenment and the spirit of the age that he's working with, and which he can never divorce himself really from. We can't have the forms of thinking of that we'll have 200 years from now. But that humanistic essence is still there. So he's not wrong in that point specifically. Yeah, we want to transform society, and he shows scientifically how that's the case. That's why it's scientific socialism. But we don't want socialism just so that the structures and institutions and the way you produce is different. We want it because implied in that is a higher level of human freedom. The first time we can actually, in terms of the unity of existence and essence, the first time humanity can actually be free. That's why he calls class society the prehistory of humanity and says that humanity's actual history starts with socialism, with the kingdom of freedom. And that's sort of an inversion on Hegel, who looked at the freedom and historical progress in terms of freedom from the standpoint of the notion of freedom. So he develops the idea that we have achieved the end of history because we've came to the idea with Christianity that all men are free. And, we start with one is free, some are free, and then all are free. And we come to the end, and it's a matter of realizing it. Marx says, no, what matters is actual freedom. And so this can only start with socialism. But that ethic is still there. And we still want to radically transform human beings and create what Jay called a new man. It's an ethical political transformation, as Gramsci spoke of, that we're involved in. So, and that's the part which I think is usually the most appealing to people. I've been seeing quite a few interviews from Gabor Mate, Aaron Mate's dad. He's a prominent psychologist, someone working, I think, within the tradition of like so-called Marxist psychology and the tradition of like Erich Fromm and others who wish to overcome the bourgeois division of the individual and society, of thinking from the body, of our minds from the body, and who ends up coming to very radical conclusions. And I just saw this interview he did with one of these bourgeois channels, got millions of views, but the guy always has like business moguls on. And they're talking about how our society is genuinely sick, how, it's a trauma and stress ridden society that's literally killing people, and it ends up manifesting itself in these chronic illnesses that we assume are just genetically handed down, and that they're just luck of the draw illnesses, when in reality they're rooted in stress and in trauma and in the society that produces all of that within our families and then thereby within individuals. And your question is, well, how do we overcome this so that we can be so that we can live the sorts of human lives that allow us to flourish and develop virtuously, right? For those that are in my Marxism and History of Philosophy classes, what we'll be talking about, not this week coming up, but the next week, right? Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics and Marxism and developing a communist virtue ethics. How can we have a society where humans could be freer to flourish? And the guy has to end up, the bourgeois interviewer has to end up kind of accepting, yeah, we need to radically overroot the forms of social life that we have so that all of these fetters for human freedom are removed. Capitalism not only fetters our ability to produce more and more efficiently, it also fetters the superstructure, which means it fetters us philosophically and culturally and artistically, aesthetically. It's a project that is deeply embedded in creating the greatest conditions for human freedom and flourishing. That's why it's deeply humanistic. And I'll leave it there. I don't want to keep ranting. I can rant about this all day.
It was an awesome rant. I'm not going to complain, brother. I just want to add real quick that two things. One, what Lyin Lindsay here is saying is sort of not far off base, in that he's describing the basic base and superstructure, which he's then going to pretend you can deviate from, right? When it is the center of materialism itself, and you can't. But what happens is he's acting as if Marx just kind of believes this ad hoc, just out of nowhere, when Marx goes to great lengths to substantiate why this is the case and how this develops out of Hegel. Engels does the same thing, even drawing on the limits of previous societies and explaining how this all fits together, right? But he's not going to ever say that because he wants to act like Marx has no reason for this. Secondly, he's going right now, hey, forget about it. He's doing this. And for anyone who's not familiar, a very sophomore public speaking trick is to do this a lot with your fingers. It supposedly gets a crowd on your side.
He's just Italian, and right now you're doing anti-Italian discrimination, and simply I won't stand for it. No, I actually saw a TikTok today. This guy was like complaining about all the kids who claim that their mental health issues or psychological issues stem from trauma. He's like, not everything stems from trauma. Quit thinking everybody has trauma and everything's trauma. I'm like, well, maybe we just have a system that traumatizes everyone, and induces people with mental illness. Like Howard Waitskin was writing about that in the 70s or 80s in his book, The Second Sickness, which is from the perspective of healthcare, basically saying it's impossible to treat the population under capitalism because it induces them with so many stresses and traumas.
And we will have a socialist society. A perfect communism that transcends private property, is how he put it. He said,
no, he did not. He never said perfect society. Sorry.
Is the transcendence of private.
I just got to get utopian and scientific. Anytime people say Marxism is a utopia, we hit them in the head with that book and move on.
Private property as human self-estrangement. That's a quote from the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. So Marx was interested in controlling are understanding and controlling how man produces himself.
Another lie. Ding! He wasn't interested in controlling. What? Pulls that out of his ass. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, he wanted the workers to be in control of production in their own lives, which they're currently not under the dictatorial, authoritarian system of capitalism, to use one of the bourgeoisie's own words.
Exclusively in the 1840s. Very deeply. How do we do this? And he looks at the economic conditions and he says, this is where it is. And that's why we get economic Marxism.
I gotta stop again. I am so sorry. He does not begin with, how do we do this? He begins with, this is happening.
Marx was an economist. But Marx was never an economist. He was a theologian. He wanted to...
Anybody who knows anything about classical economics, even if you're not a Marxist, they know that is an idiotic thing to say, right? Marx answered so many of the questions that Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the bourgeois economists set out for themselves, to the point where, and I wrote about this in my article about neoclassical economics, they had to come up with a new economic science to justify capitalism and to justify the reign of the bourgeoisie, because classical economics had been so thoroughly refuted or brought to its logical conclusions in the places where Adam Smith and David Ricardo were actually doing scientific analysis. So Marx made huge economic advancements. And, you don't even have to be a Marxist to recognize this. You just have to, look at the field of economics historically. But of course, he's not going to do that.
I just want to real quick. Real quick. That this right here, what he's doing, this line on the screen, is the weakness of all bourgeois thought. It reverts to them having to guess what was going on in Marx's brain. Look, he wanted to produce a religion for mankind. Tell me where Marx wrote that he wanted that. Tell me a friend of his that said that he told him that. Tell me you had a machine that read that in his brain. You cannot guess what Marx wanted. You can only extrapolate from what he said, what he did. You cannot just go to, all these things happened. The world was changed because of the work Marx did and Marxists have done. All because Marx wanted to create a religion for mankind? What? That comes from nowhere but inside Lyin Lindsay.
That comes from L. Ron Hubbard in the Church of Scientology that this guy mixed up with Marxism somehow. I think since it's taking us so long to get through this, we should just go to this part, the most replayed part of the video, and get through that, and then maybe do a part 2 later, so we don't end up taking 3 hours on this, unless you guys want to do it all now. But
I'll have to take a break to eat. Maybe it might be fun to do a part 1 now, and then later tonight come back and finish it up.
I'd be down.
Religion for mankind that would supersede all of the religions of mankind and bring him back to his true social nature. And this is the true fact of Marx. And what the goal was, like I said, is to complete man. So what he said is, well, how are we building man currently? All of his economic analysis is about how are we building man at present through what he called material determinism. And he said, well,
what? Stop.
What we have is a
Ding, another lie. What is material determinism?
Are you going to refute the theory of material determinism, Noah? That we all believe in material determinism. It's the second most important theory behind inversion of praxis. As soon as I figure out what these mean.
That needs a clip.
Yeah, somebody clip that. Sorry, I cut off your analysis here.
Analysis of what? Material determinism? It's a made-up nonsense. It sounds jargony.
I think what he was trying to say is that for Marx, and this is true, material conditions determine social consciousness, and the sort of persons that we are is determined by the forms of life that we exist in, which are historically constituted and rooted in material relations of production. And I'm sorry, but it's not just Marx kind of, I wouldn't say he discovers it. There's hints of it in other places. He elaborates it to the point of it being a discovery, and opens up the field of history to fully scientific inquiry. But it's not just Marx anymore. Like, bourgeois historiography can't do the things it did before anymore, or as in the same way that it did it before. You can't just look at history from the standpoint of major historical actors, because people are like, well, it doesn't really explain much to me. You can't just look at history from the standpoint of just ideas and the movement of ideas, because it really doesn't fully explain it. So the best, even bourgeois historians, are forced to look at how it is that the material basis of society plays a role in producing changes, both in ideas and creates organically certain leaders to prop up, and then all of that connected leads to new stages in history. So, what Marx wrote, just like bourgeois economists have accepted in a form that aligns with their interests, the idea that capitalism is prone to crisis every 8 to 10 years, bourgeois historians have accepted that if you really want to understand something and explain a historical phenomena, you have to get at the roots of material production. And Eddie has often cited Edward Baptiste's book, the Half Has Never Been Told, and there's a bunch of examples of that. I mean, Du Bois, before he became explicitly a Marxist, he was just a brilliant thinker who was organically realizing that if I really want to understand this historical period, I'm going to have to describe its material relations, the class antagonisms that existed, the developments of certain technological devices that changed things, and then how that's related to new ideas that arose, and how that all together, along with organic leaders that were propped up, led to certain specific changes. And he was doing that before he became explicitly a Marxist. And there's so many examples of that in the best of bourgeois historians, and not that Du Bois is a bourgeois historian, but so this idea that...
Let me interrupt real quick, Carlos, because I actually got to run out there for 2 seconds. Wait till you hear what he tries to say. Du Bois is the, like, sort of, we call Du Bois the father of American Marxism. He basically says Du Bois is a source of critical race theory later on. I'm not lying. It's the most absurd thing. All right, I'll be right back.
A special form of private property in our society. Our society is organized around private property. And so all of our thoughts organize around private property. In other words, there's a special kind of property that the bourgeois elite class has access to, and then they organize society to exclude everybody else from access to that property through exploitation, through alienation, through estrangement, through oppression. And so what Karl Marx was proposing is that economics becomes a vehicle to separate society into a bourgeois class that has access to a special form of property. The people who have access wish to retain that, so they oppress people and keep other people out of that special form of property. They erect a system of classism to do that. It's enforced by an ideology called capitalism that believes that this is the right way to engage in the world. And what we have to do is awaken the underclass, the proletariat, to the real conditions and the fact that they are historical agents of change, and bring them to do a revolution and transform society so that we would have equity.
All right, stop again real quick.
He's confusing so much. Economics is a vehicle for the bourgeoisie to own private property. It's just jumbling a bunch of stuff together. The economic system that we have is what Marx analyzed, which is the capitalist mode of production, which is based on private property ownership hoarded by the bourgeoisie and protected legally by the bourgeoisie. And yes, they use their control of the cultural apparatuses to push bourgeois ideology. But the ideology itself isn't called, capitalism. It's almost like this theory that people espouse that we just made up capitalism, that we invented capitalism one day, that it wasn't a system that evolved from previously existing class struggles. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm sorry. I almost interrupted you there, Eddie. I caught myself. That's almost exactly what I was thinking. Everything he's saying here is imagining that people get these ideas and then put them into reality. He's baking his own if he actually thought about that assumption for a minute, very stupid assumption, into everything. But because he's just so ideologically driven, it doesn't even faze him. So people get this notion of doing X and then put, capitalism into being and create these economies to withhold property from other people. No, that's not what Marx says. These arise due to the relationships we enter into that are in contradiction with the way that we produce things, right? And this leads to new things. Private property doesn't arise for rich people to oppress other people. It arises naturally due to the continual relation between always advancing production and always advancing relations of production.
And he's got it very backwards there, because it presupposes the things that he's saying it produces. And private property relations as juridical established relations presupposes that form of production. And they both arise dialectically and reinforce each other, but he was kind of making it seem backwards there. But you know what this guy is? He's the embodiment of that saying, which is like they know enough to be dangerous. Like they know the key terms in sometimes in a whole host of different contradictory worldviews, and he just meshes it all together in ways that the person that is uninformed, and unfortunately that includes a big chunk of the American people who have been lied to and kept intentionally ignorant by the ruling class, because if not they'd be overthrown by them. So that when these people listen to it, they're like, oh my God, look at all these buzzwords and how he connects them. This guy's fucking brilliant. And that is him knowing enough, which is not anything at all, but knowing enough to be dangerous, and that enough that he knows is like the terms.
Is this true? Did he just open up an encyclopedia website? And all of the people who like him are just not like they're just so easily sort of swayed by an argument that they don't even bother checking. That's wild to me. It's
I
like
guarantee
reading Wikipedia.
All right. Yeah, I guarantee you this guy just Googled Mao or socialism with Chinese characteristics and found that, Britannica article. That's funny. Why go to the source? It's just like that tick history guy who quoted Carlos instead of he quoted Carlos quoting Marx rather than quoting Marx. He thought it was Carlos Marx.
Whatever word you want, they have the same definition. Now let's say that we step out. We step back from this species, this economic species, Homo economicus, and we step back to the genus, and we look at this idea, a special form of property that segregates society into people who have the bourgeois.
Stop real quick. I'm so sorry. Marx does not say that it is a special form of property that segregates society, but that since the notion of property itself came into being, and not the notion, the thing, that this separated society. That's a lot different. What he's talking about is Marx thinks that capitalism coming into being was the beginning of this. But Marx it goes to great lengths to explain that's not the case. That it's the history of all hitherto existing society is a relation, or the history of class struggles, right, between master and slave and plebeian and lord, or whatever. I'm butchering that, but you know what I mean.
Who are in class conflict with an ideology that keeps this in place. And the underclass must awaken with consciousness to fight back and to seize the means of production of that form of deterministic property. And now we say, change out class, put in race, and watch, we get critical race theory falls out of the hat.
No, it doesn't. That's not what.
And can I just say, he's making it seem as if it's still 1846, let's go 1848, with the manifesto because the German ideology wasn't published. It's still 1848, and Marx and Engels are saying this, and they're backing it up with some evidence, but it's not scientifically conclusive yet. I mean, it's complete bullshit, and I'm referring here to the point that he was making before. It's proven through economic anthropology and through studies that have been done, scientific studies, into how it is that uh, class societies have developed out of primitive or primary communities. It's been proven that the Marxist thesis from the 1840s, from the mid 1840s, are true. Like, no one rejects that. That's all been scientifically proven. And so he's like, the areas where he thinks he's going against Marxism are the areas where the bourgeois specialists themselves in various areas have had to admit that Marx was right. And this specifically is not just the Marxian thesis. You already have it in Rousseau, where the idea is that private property ends up developing all these sorts of contradictions, but it is itself shaped by certain developments that we make in our ability to produce, that are a product of having to react to difficulties that we encounter in our environment, that forces ingenuity. Ingenuity eventually leads to us producing more than we need, and that ends up leading at some point. He describes it in a very contingent fashion, but at some contingent point, someone says, "This is mine," and boom, property starts. But so it's like he's making it seem like these points that are essential to Marxism aren't already confirmed by the bourgeois sciences themselves ever since Henry Louis Morgan.
Right. And as Noah said, critical race theory isn't Marxism, but there are a lot of liberal and bourgeois ideologues nowadays who try to take away class and obscure class and say the primary contradiction is race. All we need is racial struggle. They're basically calling for like racial warfare, but that is one of the things they try and do, obscure class and put race in there. But it's not you shake Marxism and that falls out of the hat. Once you stop seeing class as the primary contradiction in society, it's no longer Marxism, right? Now you've gone into liberalism, you've gone into something else. So to say that, you have Marxism and then it just leads to replacing this view of class with the view of race, no, that's antagonistic to Marxism. In Marx's day, there were still people writing about scientific racism and shit. They were trying to say that, colonialism was just the way of the world because the black people and brown people in the global South weren't as smart and as good as the white people in the West. And Marx was saying, no, of course not. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, not racial struggle. There are material factors that allowed Europe to become the dominant colonial power. It's not because of the color of their skin. To say that you can just replace class with race and it's still basically Marxism is totally absurd.
Wild. And I just want to say this one more time. Like, CRT, critical race theory, is a bourgeois theory that attempts to address a real problem. But Marxism has already addressed this in an actual deep manner where basically these struggles of racialized people are very literally a class struggle. It is a struggle of working people against a ruling class. And the way that looks, its characteristics are determined by the history that goes into it. The struggle against chattel slavery, right, was a revolution of these people against a ruling class, not against even the racist white working class, right? But against that ruling class.
Right, and just to address this real quick from Chris, is race a material relation like class? I would say that both yes and no. Engels says in a letter, I believe it was to Conrad Schmidt. I might be wrong, but it's an 1890s letter within the collection of like letters on historical materialism. He says that race is a factor within the economic base, and that was true in the U.S. at its time, because he's dealing with 1890s U.S. So you have lynching going on, institutionalized racism, Jim Crow, red lines and just a literal underclass of people. But that kind of changes after the Third American Revolution with the Civil Rights Movement, such that race has become less and less and less a material factor within the economic base. Um, yeah.
1993, Cheryl Harris wrote a long article for the Harvard Law Review called Whiteness is Property. She explained that whiteness, or white privilege, constitutes a kind of cultural private property. She says it must be abolished in order to have racial justice. Just like Karl Marx said that in the Communist Manifesto, he wrote, communism can be summarized in a single sentence, the abolition of private property.
All right, stop real quick. He's assuming his own mistakes into what Marx says again. When Marx says this, he's saying that communism is this process, right? It is society coming out of private property, all of this property developing and developing and developing to a point where private property becomes something else because there's nowhere left for it to go. It has developed to its absolute fullest, and something higher comes out of that. That is a theory of the communists. That's what he says. Not the theory of the communists is we hate private property and we're going to get rid of it, which is what he's trying to say that means. Not the same thing.
Yes, and we've hit our stopping point here. I think unless you guys want to keep going, we can be done with this guy and return to him later for a part 2. It took us an hour and 20 minutes to get 8 minutes and 30 seconds in, mostly because Noah and Carlos can't shut the fuck up, but also because of how many lies were in this guy had packed into just a 30-minute speech. So blatant lies to the point where you got to wonder if he knows, if he knows that he's lying and he's just trying to spew propaganda. You said he's pretty high up, right, Noah, in some kind of bourgeois organization. So it's probably the case that he knows his only job is to obscure what Marxism actually is. Even if he doesn't know exactly what he's doing, I think he does know what he's doing in a way.
He has to know he hasn't actually studied Marxism. He has to know that. And therefore he is lying no matter which way it comes out. And basically he's like, for some reason, people think he's some great thinker and has debunked Marxism. Like that Tick History guy was basically just regurgitating a crappier version of the showmanship that he has, right? All he does is dress up his incorrect and really ridiculous statements with fancy sounding words and a few quotes here and there that he pulled out of Marx and takes out of context, and then makes up, things like the inversion of praxis.
By the way, I just want to say here, a friend is correct. This is a very important book for understanding what it is that we mean when race or women's struggles or national struggles are taken as forms of class struggle.
Never far from me. This book, amazing book.
I think that, there's a tweet that we put out a few days ago about pessimism and the paradox of pessimism, which is that these radical forms of pessimism, what Kari Shukrov calls the radicalization of the impossibility of exit, there's so much, they're so promoted by bourgeois, the bourgeois political economy of knowledge, and the bourgeoisie benefits so deeply from our pessimism, and in the same way that should let us know that shit, if they think we can do something, and that is implied in the fact that they're spending so much in developing these ideologues to make us think that we can't do anything, that hints to us that we are powerful and we can change the existing state of affairs because our enemies, if anything, really believe so, and they spend so many resources doing it. It's the same thing with like these distortions of Marxism. If Marxism was false, if Marxism didn't work, they wouldn't spend so many resources propping up a fake radicalism and then having puppets like James Lindsay just feed into that and prop each opposite side of bourgeois ideology up in order to always leave real Marxism, outside of the conversation. It's the same argument would make with respect to socialist countries. Socialism doesn't work. Why you have to blockade it? If Cuba doesn't work, just let it be. Why put a blockade and ensure that any small adjustment that they make to work around it, you then readjust the blockade so so if these things are failures or untrue, let them be so by their own weight. Why force them down and then somehow they still keep popping up and predicting things or succeeding or whatever the case might be? And that should help us understand that it is a powerful worldview. It is a worldview that can help us change the world, and that we can change the world. And even when we feel like the horizon is very bleak and obscure and we don't know how to move forward, we should have that sort of comfort that, if anything, the ruling class, our enemy, knows that we can do it. So we should too.
Really, really well said, brother. I guess I'll just end it here by saying that if James Lindsay ever wants to be an actual man and defend the things he says, he knows where to find me, or any of us. And here's the thing that really bothers me about these types. They always talk about being tough and blah, 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 right? But they hide behind ignoring the truth. Always. They cannot have a simple, honest conversation with one of the three of us ever. Because when they do that, all those lies will be exposed. The gravy train ends. And I was thinking about this before this, right? I'm a family man. I really, everything I learned about being a man is from Pops, my dad, right? And I put a lot of stock into sort of having built myself into the sort of person that my son can look at and go, I'm proud of him. I want to be like that when I grow up, right? How do these people who know they are lying and taking a bunch of money for lies ever able to look their children in the eye? I could never do that if that were me. If I knew I was taking money to lie to people to make society worse, even if I didn't know for a fact it would make society worse, if I sort of just believed it would be better, if I didn't know it, I could never look my kids in the eye. Ever, ever, ever. And so, like, the notion that they have some family values or that they're tough when they can't confront the truth and can't even be honest with their children, I'm sorry. It just don't add up.
It's like, I don't know if you watch my coverage of the Steven Crowder thing, but it's like that. He's preaching, everyone should be socially conservative and traditional and, be a family man, and that should be enforced by the government. And then behind the scenes, he's abusing his wife. It's like, if you believe in these conservative traditional values, why don't you live by them, jackass? But I think these people know what they are. They know that they're liars and propagandists for money. And I mean, people don't like, I've talked about this a lot. I've even felt the pull, to sell out. I've never even considered doing it, but like, I was offered a job with the Biden campaign and, some sort of government agency job. And even when our TikToks were getting banned, I was like, well, maybe I should drift more towards liberalism so we can keep our TikTok accounts up. But decided not to. But that pull is always there, right? That you can sell out at any moment, start repeating bourgeois bullshit, and the money's going to start flowing in. So these people who have allowed the money to flow in, I think they know that they've sold their soul to the devil in a lot of cases. I don't know if Jesse Lee Peterson knows, but other people. We should have him on for a debate.
I would love to talk to him.
I would too.
Beta.
The Uncle Ruckus guy?
What was that, Carlos?
Is that like the real life Uncle Ruckus dude that I've seen just say a bunch of racist shit?
Is he? He's a black guy. I don't know. His catchphrase, he just goes, Beta. It's very good.
It's funny because of how stupid it is, but I
Mhm.
think that there's a point that could be made here, and it was one that was already made by Marx. There's a part of the manifesto where they're getting accused for wanting to abolish family relations, and the reality is that that's like capitalism already abolishes all of that. Capitalism is in terms of any sort of bond that is not mediated by the needs of capital, it abolishes them. And so it's always been a force that's been like anti-family. And if you relate your whatever the hell notion of conservatism you have to like the flourishing of families or something, capitalism is the system that is the most antagonistic to that, because it's fundamentally a dehumanizing system, and families are human forms of coming together, which don't have to be limited to like the nuclear family. Historically, they've been a lot more communal, but even with an idea of the nuclear family, the the notion that capitalism is somehow a conservative force in that field is completely absurd. It's always been a force of dissolving families, and we've seen this with neoliberalism. Like the rates of divorces, do you know how impossible it is to keep up a family in the US if you're a young person, to think about having a kid? I'm called crazy all the time because I decided to have a kid, not because people are anti-children, but because they can't have this wonderful experience of parenting because of how difficult it is to survive in our society. And I'm feeling those difficulties in my everyday life. Like the prices for formula are going up, and the prices for baby food and diapers and our food and our bills and everything is going up. And it's impossible. If you actually care about family values, you have to be a staunch anti-capitalist, right? The only society that can prioritize family values or families in a genuine sense, and I don't mean this in a form that's limited to the traditional notions of family, but it's only socialism that does that because it prioritizes human beings in general. So that's why I'm seeing like, and not to say that Tucker's an archetype of this transition of I care about families and therefore I'm anti-capitalist, not at all. But like some of the most viral statements that he's been making, the one that we reacted to last time, you and I, Eddie, of him saying, yeah, it's gonna affect 10 million families if we allow AI to just come in and displace people from their jobs. It's if your analysis is centered on how can families flourish as a form of a human unit, um, you have to be anti-capitalist. They can only flourish under a society where they're comfortable to even there's the comfort provided so that they can even exist, where women or whoever plays the domestic role doesn't have to be enslaved in that, where there's childcare, universal childcare, and you look and it's only socialist societies that have been able to accomplish this and free the family and allow the families to flourish. And yeah.
And not only that, that was a thing about AI. And he said he would hold AI back and self-driving cars because it will put all those families out of work. But if we have a socialist society and we're producing things for need rather than the profits of a couple of assholes at the top, we can let those self-driving cars go wild and develop to their utmost, and then we don't have to drive anymore, right? Those people who are driving 12-hour days don't have to do that anymore, or don't have to work as much, right? They can operate whatever AI instead. We can develop in a way that just makes our lives easier rather than makes more money for like I said, the assholes at the top.
Absolutely, and I mean that's what we discussed on Tucker. Those points specifically in our last stream. Yeah. So do you guys want to watch Jesse Lee Peterson's greatest moments next, or what? You got anything else for us today, Noah?
I'm down to do part 2 because the end of this gets pretty good too. But I'm down to do part 2 later. Right now, I got to do dinner with the wife since, again, a family man.
Right, you're putting your money where your mouth is now.
What was that?
You're putting your money where your mouth is now. Except it's Noah's about to go to McDonald's and eat by himself. It's all a lie.
Actually, before we started this, she went and picked up a rotisserie chicken,
Oh,
which we only recently got into. So we're doing like that and some rice and naan bread. Dude, it's so good. So good.
if you're poor out there and you want to get your protein and eat healthy, rotisserie chicken, man. I'll get one and just eat the whole thing in a night. They're so good.
So good. And it's like sometimes when like you're in the supermarket and you walk by it, you're like, oh, I gotta go there. You know, like there's no way not to get that chicken after you smell it.
That's one of the weirdest, like, and I have never. It's one of those things that like racism is so deeply irrational, like the stereotype that only like black people like chicken. What? Everyone loves fucking chicken. I can't go into Walmart without like being the meme of like the chicken drawing me, and I'm just going towards it. It's so stupid, and like all of these ideologies are so deeply irrational. And if I had a critique of Lukács's theory of irrationalism, is that he sees it starting off in 1848 with the bourgeois forces becoming officially counter-revolutionary, but in reality, like the history of at least the most racialized forms that capitalism has had to take in order to divide workers, it's so deeply irrational. There's few things that make less sense than racism. And racial stereotypes, they couldn't be any stupider. They couldn't, and the chicken is a perfect example. I don't, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Everybody loves chicken.
Yep. I grew up in a black neighborhood, as you know, and when I would go to like holiday events, like black parties, barbecues, birthday parties, whatever, if there was a cookout, like these kind of jokes were always just what we did, right? So like a friend would like bring a plate over to the table, and like kids would have like chicken, you know, piled high on it, but there'd be no chicken on mine. Right? Like he's like, oh, I didn't get you. You can't have that. That's a black thing, dude. So funny.
It's so true though. It's such, I mean, that was what I thought the first time I read imperialism, because I guess if you look at the state of the world and the way that the bourgeois media portrays the global South, you know, it is like, why is all the wealth concentrated in the white nations? But then you learn about colonialism and imperialism. You're like, oh, the material factors. Yeah, you know, these were just, Europe was the first place to industrialize, really, and capitalism developed there first. So they were able to export capital abroad and super exploit foreign countries. But I think that's just my theory for why a lot of like young Americans still fall into racist white supremacist ideologies. They look at the world and there's no explanation for this divide, this wealth gap, until you start to study, like, I don't know, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa or something like that. And then it starts to make sense. But that's also why I say Marxism is the ultimate debunk for racism, or, you know, IQ science or whatever. Like, once you understand that things have material bases, nothing could appear more stupid than the ideology that things happen because certain races are superior to others, or certain races have certain characteristics. Like, just there's no evidence for it. It's so fucking irrational.
There used to be a saying back in the day that anti-Semitism was socialism for stupid people. It's like the conclusion that leads you to socialism. If you're stupid, you go to racism or anti-Semitism, whatever, you know.
And the dangerous part is that a lot of these things are coming back in culturalist or woke forms, and the fad in the academy is to talk about reason as something that belongs to Europe. Excuse me? You know, you read some of these post-colonial theorists and the way they speak about reason, it's like, what is implied here if not the fact that Europe is rational, the rest of the world is not, except that the way that it's being done is in a way that's like, yeah, but European reason, it's bad. The rest of the world's reason is good. So that doesn't take away the deeply racist thing you just fucking implied, which is that non-Europeans are irrational. Mm-hmm. Or have a fundamentally different form of reason. I mean, what the fuck are you talking about? And that's one of those things where, like, critique of liberalism today and the forms that it's taken, or wokeism, if you don't do it not only are you like missing half of bourgeois ideology and making your war of positions a one-legged, one-armed war of positions, and you're not going to be able to really win, but you're opening the door for the return of the most deeply reactionary philosophical assumptions. The same philosophical assumptions that perpetuated race science and all other forms of racist ideologies, except under a woke version. And that is scary because that can any moment turn into the opposite and stop being woke and be more explicitly reactionary. And we're seeing hints of it here and there, but
Right. And it seems like the right goes more towards racism than to counteract that, right?
Mhm.
They just see the enemy as wokeism, and they're like, well, the truth must be racism then.
Well, it's like the
And,
only
sorry,
difference.
one more thing too. Like Carlos and I saw a girl the other day. Carlos sent it to me. She was on a podcast, and she was like, I just had this red pill moment the other day where I realized, like, why would I ever argue with my boyfriend? Men are always right. Men are better at raising children. Men are better at cooking. Men are better at everything. I'm like, so because these kids are being indoctrinated with liberalism and wokeism, they think, oh, I got to take the red pill and go the opposite direction. That's the truth they're trying to hide from me, till they end up in these insane, sexist, self-deprecating positions.
If you're looking for the real red pill, it's inside Marx's Capital. Open that up, you'll find it, I promise. But like, here's the thing: between the smart white supremacists like Richard Spencer, who know how to talk and try to package what they say, and a lot of the woke liberals, every single assumption is the same. The only difference is that Spencer says, well, all of these things are correct. My opinion on the conclusion is just different. He says, he likes the white race, and the woke say they don't, or whatever it is. But the fundamental assumptions that people are inherently different and incompatible and cannot live together, cannot think the same, do not approach it, nothing is similar, those are the same. That is like literally, that's like Heidegger's whole thing on how people develop, right? And what his version of being is connected to a certain people and land, etc. And if you come from outside that land, you're an enemy to them.
I mean, I don't know what more OG version of identity politics than the white nationalist. That's identity politics, except like you said, the identity that's fetishized and reified and projected into its own thing, divorced from any social relations upon which it is dependent, is the white identity. Which is weird because whiteness has had to include more and more like groups that weren't historically white, the Irish, the Italians, Jewish people, and it shows the flexibility of these categories and the fact that at their core, what they end up playing is just a very fundamental role for dividing working people under capitalism, and that's why there's this really good phrase that I always bring up from Carlos Martinez, which is that I believe it's him quoting Malcolm X, but it's something along the lines of capitalism cannot function without racism. And I think here we can go beyond just racism and speak about these more woke forms of dividing the people that have these racist assumptions underpinning them. And socialism cannot function with those things. Socialism seeks to overcome all of those things and remove these artificial divisions that capitalist ideology brings into the people in order to divide and conquer. If we're divided and fighting over the things, our accidental properties and not our substantial sameness, the capitalists are going to, steamroll right through us. But if we're united and we realize that objectively our conditions are similar and that we have the same interests and that the difference that we have, whether it's racial or sexual or whatever it might be, it doesn't. It's not a more substantial. It's not of a more substantial character than the similarities we have as working and poor people and exploited and oppressed people. until we're able to do that, we're not able to unite. And whether it's through explicit racist false consciousness or woke forms of false consciousness, it all serves to divide the people. And at this moment in history, a central question that we should ask, whether it's someone we're listening to or an ideological worldview that we're reading about, whatever it is, a central question we should ask is this helping to unite the people against capitalism and imperialism? Or is it dividing them? Is it fragmentating the working class? And both in the same way that the racists used to fragmentate the working class, today a lot of the wokes are too.
That's a really, really great place to end it, brother. I think
this is a great stream.
We will see y'all again for part 2 of taking down Lyin Lindsay or Lyin James Lindsay in the future. But for now, thank you everybody for watching and for all of your great comments and questions. Thank you to the people that gave super chats, etc. One more time, we get throttled for real. Please hit like, subscribe, etc. Go to midwesternmarx or patreon.com/midwesternmarx if you want to help us out. We also have a buy me a coffee now. And we will see you guys all next time. Have a
and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.